Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the absolute masterclass of political messaging. We're going to break down a recent, highly charged interview from News 24 featuring former RNC spokeswoman Elizabeth Pipko. Now, we're looking strictly at the source material here to unpack what we call the rhetoric of contrast. How do political figures actually frame their opponents? How do they position their allies? And how in the world are they already laying the groundwork for the 2028 election when we're literally still staring down the midterms? Well, by digging into the specific claims and language used in this interview, we get a real behind-the-scenes look at modern political narrative building. Because these are the exact tools that shape the news you and I consume every single day. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at framing the Democratic Party. Second, the mail-in voting clash. Third, Trump's midterm strategy. And finally, predicting the 2028 election.
Starting off with Section 1, framing the Democratic Party, and specifically the rhetoric surrounding Philadelphia DA Larry Krasner. So early on in this News 24 interview, the critique of the Democratic Party gets anchored to a highly specific, totally viral quote. Philadelphia District Attorney Larry Krasner publicly stated this desire to, quote, blow up the White House ballroom in what he called an official ceremony. He even went on to claim he'd sell the pieces back to taxpayers to refund their money, all while keeping one piece as a paperweight for his own desk. Now, the argument presented by Pipko here is that Krasner practiced and calculated this exact line, knowing for sure it would generate outrage and immediate media attention. It's a really fascinating look at how provocative, localized rhetoric is practically manufactured just to catch the eye of the national news cycle.
But here is the absolutely crucial part. It's how this single localized quote gets weaponized. Notice the explicit label being used, the party of violence. The source takes Krasner's viral moment and uses it to brand an entire political apparatus. This is a classic rhetorical strategy. You take one inflammatory statement from a local official, and you cast this massive national net to frame the whole political opposition as a collective extremist threat. When you're watching the news, it's so important to spot this tactic. It really shows how political strategists don't just react to opponents' sound bites, they actively harvest them to define the broader identity of the opposing party. They're literally turning individual actors into symbols of a collective danger.
Moving on to Section 2, the mail-in voting clash. This is all about the battle over election rules and 2028 positioning.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how polarized election law has become. On one side, we've got California Governor Gavin Newsom pushing back hard against the Trump administration's efforts to restrict mail-in voting. Newsom's argument? He claims that enforcing these challenge provisions will disenfranchise voters across the country. But, completely counter to that, Pipko frames the Trump administration's actions purely as a defense of election integrity. She points to a lack of trust in the mass volume of mail-in ballots we saw during the 2020 pandemic and demands measures like photo IDs to vote. It's a perfect snapshot of two totally competing narratives surrounding the exact same policy. One side frames it as voter protection, while the other frames it as ballot security.
Now, let's look at how this builds into a much larger accusation about political motives. Pipko asserts that Newsom's lawsuit actually has nothing to do with leading the people of California to success or prosperity. Instead, it's framed as a highly calculated game. The claim here is that Newsom is deliberately focusing his energy on taking on Donald Trump just to score points, gain popularity, go viral, and ultimately position himself for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2028. It's an interpretation that views state-level legal action purely through the lens of future national ambitions. For us watching at home, it's a huge reminder of how every local legal battle is often just a proxy war for the next presidential race. It really changes the way you interpret state-level news, doesn't it? That brings us to Section 3, Trump's midterm strategy. We're looking at momentum and the midterm RNC in Texas.
Now, even though his name isn't actually on the November ballot, the source outlines a seriously active couple of months for Donald Trump. He's scheduled to appear on both nights of what's being called the first-ever midterm Republican National Convention down in Texas. His tactics? They revolve around touting the successes of his 2024 agenda, leveraging those signature massive arena rallies, and showing up at highly patriotic events like the Freedom 250. Since he isn't the one being voted on, the primary goal here is tactical momentum. He's essentially acting as a high-profile surrogate, kissing babies, signing autographs, and stumping for downstream candidates who desperately need his dedicated base to turn out at the polls.
And that brings us to the framing of Trump himself within this interview. Pipko uses incredibly superlative language here, actually calling him the most consequential leader that our country or our world has ever seen. The interview characterizes his political trajectory as a comeback story that sets a historically unmatched bar. This highly favorable image of a leader fighting for America is then deliberately contrasted against what she describes as the craziest Democrat Party that is actively trying to reverse his agenda.
It is a stark, black and white framing. And you know what? That is entirely by design. Rhetoric like this isn't just about offering an opinion. It's an active mobilization tool meant to completely energize a political base by presenting a clear hero versus villain narrative.
Finally, we arrive at Section 4, predicting the 2028 election. We're looking over the horizon at future contenders.
So the conversation inevitably turns to JD Vance, who is widely considered a top contender for the future Republican ticket. But interestingly, the source pulls from a recent quote by his wife, Usha Vance. When she was asked about doing politics on an even bigger scale, Usha stressed taking things one step at a time, keeping an open mind, but remaining laser-focused on the midterms right now. The interview enthusiastically endorses this disciplined approach. It highlights how maintaining a strict focus on the present battle is just great optics, while simultaneously positioning Usha, who is out there actively campaigning while raising 4 children, as an incredibly valuable, relatable asset for a future White House bid.
Now, what's really fascinating about how these contenders are laid out is the stark contrast in how current political betting markets are evaluated. On the Republican side, the interview presents a deep bench, confidently pointing to JD Vance and Marco Rubio as very, very strong options. But look at the Democratic column. The mentioned contenders are entirely dismissed. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is called unimaginable as a presidential contender, and the whole idea of Kamala Harris running again is brushed off as a crazy rumor. The narrative being built here is one of complete Republican readiness versus utter Democratic disarray. By projecting immense strength on one side and dismissing the viability of the other, the source uses early market speculation to solidify a message of inevitable political dominance.
Which leaves us with this final thought. We've seen how local quotes are used to brand entire political parties, how state lawsuits are viewed as calculated presidential posturing, and how betting markets are interpreted to show overwhelming strength versus profound weakness. But, as we all know, politics is famously unpredictable. So as the midterms actually play out and the dust settles, we really have to ask, will this early political posturing and highly contrasting rhetoric accurately predict the reality of 2028, or is it just the strategic noise of today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those tough questions, and I'll see you next time.